Karen stormed up the driveway, a rifle slung over her shoulder like she was some kind of neighborhood warlord. Her face was bright red, either from the heat of the summer day or from the rage she was trying to contain. I could hear her yelling something about unauthorized modifications to my property, but to be honest, the words didn't matter. What did matter was the gun. The last time I checked, HOA enforcers weren't packing heat, unless she was trying to start some weird vigilante crusade. I stepped outside, leaning against the doorframe with a hand casually tucked in my pocket. My gaze flicked over her, then down to the rifle. She was practically shaking, like the weapon was giving her the confidence she'd never earned. My eyebrow quirked up, and I gave her a long, sarcastic stare. "Really? A gun? For my driveway?" I called out, my tone dripping with sarcasm. "You know, I've had people complain about my lawn, but this is a new one. You gonna shoot me for a parking violation too?" Karen's eyes widened, her grip tightening on the rifle. "You think this is a joke?" she spat, her voice all high-pitched and trembling. "I'm not joking. I'm enforcing the HOA's rules, and you've made a serious mistake." I snorted. "Oh, I'm sure I did. But the real mistake is thinking you can waltz onto my property with a gun like some neighborhood enforcer." She puffed her chest, clearly convinced that her threats would be enough to intimidate me. "You've been violating HOA codes for months now, and I'm here to put an end to it. You've modified your property without approval. That's a direct violation of the rules." I glanced over at my property. There it was, my pride and joy, a pristine, modest house surrounded by a bit of wild landscaping. The horror! But that didn't seem to matter to Karen, not when she had a score to settle. My voice dropped into a deadpan drawl as I casually walked toward her. "You know, it's cute that you think a lawnmower is the answer to every problem. But tell me, Karen, what exactly gives you the right to show up here with a gun? Did I miss a memo that the HOA is now an armed militia?" She was so full of herself, she didn't even flinch at my question. She just kept going, rattling off her usual HOA nonsense. "The HOA has the right to enforce rules and regulations, and if you think you can just ignore them, you're sadly mistaken. You'll be fined for these violations, and if you refuse to comply, I'll make sure you're kicked out of here." I had to admit, she was really good at sounding like she was in charge. But she was also way too full of herself. And that's when I dropped the bomb. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence drag on. I could see her twitching, her face still flushed with rage, as she probably thought she was scaring me. Her hands were getting sweaty on the rifle, and I couldn't help but smile to myself. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my sheriff's badge, holding it up so she could see. "You might want to put that gun down, Karen. You're talking to the sheriff." For a split second, her expression flickered, like she couldn't process what I'd just said. It was one of those moments where you realize someone's about to go through 5 stages of disbelief in record time. Then it clicked. Her eyes widened, her face turning pale as the realization hit her. She sputtered, "WH what? You? You're the sheriff? You're just some guy." "Just some guy, huh?" I said, giving her an exaggerated once-over. "Tell me, Karen, how did I get this badge? I've only been the sheriff here for, about 6 years, so I guess I must have slipped under your radar, huh?" Real smooth. The rifle dropped slightly in her hands, the reality of the situation starting to sink in. Karen was no longer in control. And if I'm being honest, it felt good. Now, let me back up a second and tell you exactly why Karen's mistake was so, entertaining. You see, Karen had been a thorn in my side for months, always calling in complaints to the HOA about something or other. First, it was my fence, then it was my tree, then, because she just couldn't help herself, she had an issue with the fact that I had a 4x4 Jeep. It wasn't some ridiculous, oversized monster truck, it was just a normal Jeep. But in Karen's eyes, that was another violation. And every time she came around I just kept thinking, I'm really going to enjoy this. Because Karen, sweet Karen, didn't know who she was dealing with. Oh sure, she thought she was the boss, throwing around HOA rules like they were some kind of law, but she had no idea how far her reach actually went. No clue what I was capable of. See, she might have been messing with me, but I'd been messing with her too. In fact, I was already 2 steps ahead. You know how she tapped into my private well to water her precious garden? Yeah, that was cute. I let it slide the first few times, but after the 4th or 5th call from her about my unsightly garden, I'd had enough. So, I did what any responsible sheriff would do. I flushed her irrigation system with sewage. Yep. Sewage. Freeze frame, yep. That's me. The guy whose private well HOA Karen tapped into to illegally water her garden. What did I do? I flushed her system with sewage. And oh buddy, that was just the beginning. Now, before you go all, "That's illegal," on me, let me tell you, I was well within my rights to do it. I'm talking loopholes, people, big, beautiful loopholes. And Karen? She didn't even know. Not for 1 second did she even suspect what was coming her way. But standing here now, with the rifle lowering in her hands, Karen wasn't thinking about that. She was too busy trying to figure out how she'd gone from being the neighborhood enforcer to being completely out of her league. And while Karen scrambled, I was already a step ahead. I wasn't done with her yet. Not by a long shot. "I think you should leave, Karen," I said, my voice cold. "Before you make this worse for yourself. Believe me, you really don't want to test me." Her face went ashen. And then, right as she opened her mouth to say something, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. "Looks like my little backup just arrived." But Karen? She didn't know that. She just stood there, staring at me, completely blindsided. What happened next? Oh, it's a doozy. But that, well, you'll just have to wait for the next chapter. Karen stood frozen, her mouth agape as the sirens grew louder. She looked around, probably trying to figure out how in the world I'd managed to get back up so quickly. Her brain was struggling to catch up, and honestly, I was enjoying every second of it. She had thought she could waltz onto my property, rifle in hand, and bully me into submission. What she hadn't counted on was that I wasn't some average homeowner. "Don't even think about it," I said coolly, stepping toward her, my voice sharp. "You don't want to make this worse, Karen. Trust me." She blinked, trying to regain her composure. The look on her face was a mix of disbelief and seething frustration, but there was one thing she didn't have: control. For the first time since she had stormed up my driveway, she wasn't the one holding the reins. You can't just," Karen stammered, clearly scrambling for something to say. "This is my neighborhood too. I'm just enforcing the rules." I tilted my head, the sarcasm practically dripping from my tone. "The rules? Oh, you mean the rules you made up in your head? Because last time I checked, the rules didn't include showing up at someone's house with a weapon. And last time I checked, the HOA didn't have its own private army." Her grip on the rifle tightened, but it was clear she didn't know what to do with it now. The power she thought she wielded was slipping away. "You don't scare me," she spat, her face reddening even more. "I'll make sure you regret this. The HOA will have you removed. I'll have you." Before she could finish her sentence, I raised an eyebrow, letting the silence hang in the air for a beat too long. "The HOA?" I said, almost in a whisper. "Do you even know what the HOA has been up to, Karen? Because I do." That stopped her cold. She blinked at me, her angry retort dying in her throat as her mind tried to process what I'd just said. "Here's the thing," I continued, taking a step back, the smug satisfaction in my voice impossible to hide. "I've been investigating the HOA for months. I know about your little secret deals, the fines, the illegal fines, the extortion. And I know you've been tapping into my well for your little garden. And Karen, darling, that's not just a violation of HOA rules, it's illegal." She paled. For the first time, she wasn't the one in charge. She wasn't the all-powerful HOA enforcer anymore. She was the one who had to listen. Her hands trembled slightly, but her mouth was still moving, like she couldn't quite catch up to the reality of the situation. "Why, you're bluffing," Karen said weakly, her voice faltering. "You don't have anything on me. You're just some sheriff in this tiny town. You think you can scare me? You think I'm afraid of you?" I didn't even flinch. I leaned back against the railing of my porch, crossing my arms and letting the calmness of my posture contrast with the chaos in her eyes. "Scare you? No. But I'm not trying to scare you, Karen. I'm trying to remind you that there's a line and you crossed it." The sirens were getting closer, and I knew Karen was beginning to realize that the only thing standing between her and a world of legal problems was her own stubbornness. The longer she resisted, the worse it was going to get for her. "You've been doing this for far too long, Karen," I said, the words rolling off my tongue like I was talking about a nuisance I couldn't wait to be rid of. "Every time you've called the HOA to complain about me or anyone else, you've just dug yourself deeper into a hole. You think I don't know about your little scheme to hike up fees on people who don't even know their rights? You've been trying to take everyone down around here, and it ends now." Her face twisted in rage again, but this time, it wasn't as effective. The anger wasn't empowering her anymore. It was just exposing her desperation. She wanted to yell, but the words got caught in her throat. She could feel the power slipping from her grasp. You can't just ruin everything," Karen muttered, her voice tinged with fear for the first time since she'd arrived. "I didn't do anything wrong. I'm just following the rules. You're the one who's been following the rules?" I interrupted, my voice cutting through hers. "Following what rules? The ones that allow you to steal from your neighbors? The ones that let you send people into financial ruin over trivial things? Is that what you call following the rules, Karen? Because that sounds more like a crime spree to me." I could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes now. She knew it was true. She knew I wasn't bluffing. And what made it even worse for her was the fact that she had no idea how deep I'd gone into investigating the HOA. She thought she was just dealing with some random guy who didn't care enough to fight back. But I had been waiting for this moment, watching her, knowing her every move, every little mistake she'd made. Karen's hands shook as she lifted the rifle again, but this time, it wasn't with confidence. It was almost like she was trying to convince herself she still had the upper hand. "You don't know what you're doing," she hissed, her voice trembling with the pressure of the situation. "You think you can just go around ruining people's lives because you don't like the rules?" I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. "I'm not ruining your life, Karen," I said, voice soft but firm. "I'm just holding you accountable for your own actions. You've been ruining other people's lives long enough. Now it's your turn." That's when she finally lost it. In a panic, she dropped the rifle to the ground and stumbled back. Her entire demeanor cracked in an instant, and I could see her mind racing, trying to find a way out. But it was too late. She had no escape. Not now. "Don't think you're getting away with this," Karen spat, her voice barely a whisper now. "I'll fight you." "You won't get away with this." I smirked. "You're already fighting a losing battle, Karen. But by all means, keep going. You'll get your chance to explain yourself soon enough. But you might want to remember this moment, because it's the one where you realized you bit off more than you could chew." And just like that, the sirens came to a halt. I didn't look behind me. I didn't need to. Karen was already trying to figure out how to weasel her way out of this, but she wouldn't be able to. The cavalry had arrived, and I was just standing there, ready for the next move. The only question left was how far she was willing to go before she truly realized how badly she'd messed up. This was only the beginning, and I hadn't even started to play my hand. But Karen? She was about to find out what happens when you mess with the wrong guy. And that's when the real fun would begin. What happened next? Well, let's just say Karen had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went. And she was about to find out the hard way. The sirens stopped right at the end of my driveway, and the sound of car doors slamming echoed through the neighborhood. I didn't look over my shoulder, though. Karen's face was frozen in a mix of shock and disbelief, and I could feel the moment shifting. I could almost hear her brain grinding through the gears as it tried to process just how badly she'd miscalculated. She was still standing there, gripping the rifle like she thought it was some sort of shield against reality. "Think you might want to put that down now, Karen," I said, casually glancing at the officers stepping out of their patrol cars. "You've had your fun, but it's over now." The officers approached us, their eyes scanning the situation. They didn't need much to figure out what was going on. I knew most of them. Hell, half of them were probably tired of getting HOA complaints themselves. The HOA had a habit of going after the wrong people, and the more power-hungry they got, the more people started pushing back. I stepped aside, giving the officers room to move. Karen's eyes darted from one of them to the other, and for the first time, I saw her sweat. Her hands were still shaking, and the rifle, her security blanket, was now a liability. The officers didn't need me to spell it out for them. They were already onto her. "Ma'am," one of the officers said, his tone calm but firm, "we're going to have to ask you to step aside. We'll take care of this situation from here." Karen was already sputtering, trying to throw out anything that might get her out of this mess. "You don't understand. This is all a mistake. I was just enforcing the rules. He's the one who started this. He's been breaking the law for months." Her voice was high-pitched, frantic, and I could see the panic rising in her. But there was no escaping it now. The officer looked at me and then back at her, clearly waiting for her to realize she wasn't going to win this one. "What rules, Karen?" he asked. "I'm sure you can tell us all about your rules back at the station. But right now, you're holding an illegal firearm, and that's a bigger issue than your HOA code violations." Her face went even paler at that. I couldn't help but feel a little bit of satisfaction. After all, this wasn't just about one illegal gun. It was about the countless ways she had been running roughshod over the entire neighborhood, using the HOA as a tool for her own gain. She was about to get the reality check she'd been dodging for months. "Is there anything you want to add, Sheriff?" one of the officers asked me, cutting through the tension like a hot knife. I gave him a half-smile. "Yeah," I said, my voice dripping with irony. "You might want to start asking her about the way she's been using my private well to water her garden. She might be able to explain that one a little better than I can." The officer's eyes narrowed. Karen's face twisted in confusion, but that didn't last long. It was almost as if the weight of her actions was starting to sink in, bit by bit. The officer's partner pulled out a set of handcuffs and moved toward her. The moment she tried to pull away, the officer seized her by the wrist. "No. You can't do this. This is all a misunderstanding," Karen screamed, the desperation in her voice now unmistakable. I didn't feel bad for her, not for a second. She had been pushing people around for so long that she thought she could get away with anything. And now everything was unraveling. Every petty complaint she'd filed, every fine she'd tried to collect, every violation she'd pulled out of thin air, it was all coming back to bite her. "Ma'am, you are under arrest for possession of an illegal weapon, among other things," the officer said, his tone final. Karen didn't fight back as she was cuffed, but the look on her face said everything. She was still trying to find a way out, trying to wrap her mind around the fact that she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. But it was too late for that. The officer looked at me again, his expression softening slightly. "Looks like you've got some paperwork to fill out, Sheriff." "Yeah," I said, letting out a long breath. "And it's gonna take a while. Might be a good idea to start taking down some notes on Karen's little HOA escapade. You won't believe half of it." The officers led Karen to their patrol car, and I stayed behind for a moment, taking a mental inventory of what had just gone down. This had started as a simple HOA nuisance, one of those things that everyone just shrugged off, knowing Karen was always going to cause problems. But it had escalated into something bigger. Now Karen was about to get a full taste of her own medicine, and I couldn't help but feel a little bit of pride in the way things had unfolded. But this wasn't just about taking her down. This was about something more. The HOA had become a cancer in our community, A group of people who thought they could impose their will on others just because they had a little bit of power. And Karen? She was just the symptom. The HOA was the disease. I walked back toward my house, feeling a small sense of relief that this chapter was over. At least for now. But I knew this wasn't the end of it. Karen's arrest was just the first domino to fall. There was so much more to be uncovered, so much more dirt to be dug up. The HOA had been covering their tracks for far too long, and it was only a matter of time before the whole house of cards came crashing down. I glanced back at the patrol cars, watching as they pulled away. Karen, who had thought she could wield all the power, was now just another person on the receiving end of justice. But the best part? This was only the beginning. The moment she got out of jail, when she realized what was really happening, she'd come for me. I could see it in her eyes. And I was ready for it. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. So, as I stood on my porch, taking a deep breath and feeling the warm breeze brush against my skin, I knew one thing for sure. Karen might have had her moment of power, but it was over now. And the real fun was just about to start. But Karen wasn't going to know what hit her next. That was the best part. The sun was setting, painting the sky a soft orange as I sat on my porch, sipping a cold drink. It had been a few days since Karen had been carted off in handcuffs, and the neighborhood was oddly quiet. People were talking, of course. Word spread fast in small towns, and the fallout from Karen's arrest was something everyone was still processing. But for me, this was just the calm before the storm. Karen might have been taken out of the equation for now, but there was no way she was going to sit quietly. Not after everything that had happened. I knew she'd be back, and I was ready for it. The HOA had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated me. Karen had made the same mistake, thinking she could push me around because I was just another guy living in the neighborhood. But what she didn't know was that I had been watching them for months. Watching her, watching the other HOA members, seeing how they operated. I had already gathered enough dirt on them to bury them. And I had only scratched the surface. I could hear the distant hum of a car engine as I glanced toward the end of the street. Sure enough, Karen was back. She wasn't alone, though. A lawyer. Of course, she'd need one. I stood up, walking to the end of the driveway to meet them. Karen's car pulled up in front of my house, and as soon as the door opened, she stepped out, looking like she'd been through the ringer. Her face was pale, her hair a mess, and she was no longer wearing her confident, "I run this neighborhood" expression. Now, she looked more like someone who had been humbled, and I couldn't say I felt sorry for her. "Sheriff," she sneered, her eyes narrowing. "You really think you've won, don't you?" I leaned against the mailbox, not in a rush to say anything. I could see the lawyer standing next to her, his arms crossed, wearing the typical expression of someone who thought they could intimidate their way through anything. But I wasn't intimidated. I'd been waiting for this moment. Karen had never once thought this far ahead. She'd been thinking about herself, thinking she could control people with her power and her little rules. What she didn't realize was that the very system she relied on was the one that was going to bring her down. "You're out of jail," I said, the sarcasm dripping from my voice. "Guess you didn't think your little stunt would go this far, did you?" Her eyes flickered with anger, but she was smart enough not to snap back. Not right now, anyway. She was on the defensive, and I could tell she wasn't prepared for this. She had no idea what was coming. "You don't know what you're dealing with," Karen said, her voice low. "You think this is over? You're wrong. The HOA has deep pockets, and I'm not the only one who can make your life a living hell." I smiled, taking another sip of my drink. "Oh, Karen, I don't think you understand. This isn't about you anymore. You see, I've already been talking to a few people. I've got proof. Proof of everything you've done, everything the HOA's been doing. You've made a lot of enemies, and I'm just the first one to show up." Her eyes flickered with doubt. It was a small crack in her facade, but I saw it. The lawyer beside her shifted, his eyes darting to Karen, but she ignored him, focusing on me instead. I wasn't surprised. She knew exactly what I was talking about. She'd been running the HOA like her personal little empire, using it to squeeze money out of people who couldn't fight back. But now that I had the leverage, it was a different story. "You think you've got something on me?" Karen said, a little laugh escaping her lips. It was forced, but she was trying to cover her panic. "You think you can just destroy everything I've worked for?" I stepped forward, keeping my tone casual. "I don't think I'm destroying anything, Karen. I think you're doing a great job of that all on your own." She was beginning to realize that she didn't have the upper hand anymore. Her smirk faded and the panic set in. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably but didn't say anything. He probably knew he couldn't help her. "Do you want to know what I've got?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "You'd better sit down for this." I could see her hesitating. She wanted to brush me off, tell me I didn't know what I was talking about. But deep down, she knew I had her. I had every document, every email, every dirty little secret she had buried over the years. I had the proof of her illegal fines, the illegal tap on my well, and I had the backdoor deals with contractors that no one knew about. And I wasn't just talking about Karen anymore. The whole HOA was complicit in this, and I was going to make sure everyone knew it. "You've been using the HOA as a weapon," I said slowly, watching her face. "And I'm not the only one who's noticed. I've got people who've been watching your little reign of terror. People who've been too scared to say anything until now." Karen's eyes went wide, her breath quickening. She was starting to understand the weight of the situation. But I wasn't done yet. "I'm going to make sure the whole town knows what you've been doing," I said. "And not just the town. I've already been in contact with a few people who can do a little more than spread rumors. We're talking real consequences here." She stumbled back, her face crumpling as she realized the magnitude of what was coming. "You can't do this." "You!" "I already am," I said, cutting her off. "And you won't be able to hide behind your little HOA anymore. This is bigger than you, Karen. This is about people finally getting the justice they deserve." I could feel the satisfaction bubbling inside me. Watching Karen crumble, watching her panic, it was like all the months of frustration and petty annoyances were finally coming to an end. The justice she had so desperately tried to control was now out of her hands. And I wasn't going to let her take that power back. Karen turned to her lawyer, her face flushed with anger. "You need to do something," she muttered, but the lawyer only gave her a helpless shrug. He knew the game was up. "Don't worry," I said, turning on my heel. "You'll get your day in court. But I promise you, it won't be the kind of victory you're hoping for." I walked back to my porch, leaving Karen and her lawyer standing there. The whole neighborhood was watching. I didn't know how this was going to end, but I knew one thing: Karen's reign was over. The wind was picking up, and I felt a quiet sense of triumph settle over me. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about everyone she had hurt, everyone she had tried to control. And now the tables had turned. And it felt damn good.